Do I stop recording for the conversation?
We stop if, is anybody not okay? But if we record the conversation, it means you'll be recorded. If anyone's not okay with that, we'll stop. Is that all right? So we can.
Yeah. Good. Do you want to put your laptop so people can actually see the room, maybe?
I will.
So what we're gonna do now, we have like half an hour left. So we can have a discussion about what we just heard. We can kind of if somebody has questions or certain points that I want to pick up. Yeah, I'm kind of gonna moderate this a little bit. So I think I'm gonna keep track of time. So if anybody wants to say something, do you want to turn on your camera?
It's on.
No, it's off.
I'm sorry. I just switched that on. I thought I just switched that on. I didn't work.
If anybody has any questions, I think online, just let me know. You're still on the screen behind me, so we'll see you. Yeah.
I could resonate very well with everything that you have said, especially it would be great to actually read or to have the paper you just said, and where would we access it. Also, I think you did a very good exposition on one hand the social rights, and then just supposed with the rights of labor. And we have referred to Michelle Sarah. I wonder, because Canada is largely a secular society, but you also have a very strong and very progressive individual rights movement. Would there be people in Canada, especially from the First Nations people, who can offer other insights from their own experiences and history, being a marginalized society in a largely secular country, which is now because we're referring to Western thinkers like Sarah, and his contributions are definitely valuable. So I think that's very, very important. But then we also appear from the voice.
Yeah, yeah, so that's a fantastic question, which is I think it gets picked up in the social work literature around a nod to Indigenous folk art. They don't turn online. Okay, sorry. Yeah. Can folks online hear me okay? Now that I'm also active in the room. Guys online, you can hear me? Okay. So the question was around can sort of, I guess, a mainstream or settler or state-based professionals who can work learn from Indigenous peoples, like settler Indigenous relations, and specifically because I'm based in Canada, so that's sort of the reality. I think absolutely that settlers in mainstream social work or professional social work can learn from Indigenous folks for sure. I personally am trying to figure out ways of negotiating the appropriation of Indigenous knowledge for use by Western folks. So a lot of the sort of the versions of social justice or some kind of movements that are happening in Canada means that there are avenues for Indigenous folks and Indigenous sovereignty movements to get into mainstream institutions and try to build something that matters to them. But it's fragile. It is quite fragile in the Canadian nation state. So there's there's all kinds of initiatives to indigenize the academy or to ensure that there are Indigenous faculty within the social work department. But there's also massive turnover in those faculty because it's really, really, really hard to actually negotiate with state and university in the ways that normally function, the university normally functions. I personally try to read, particularly Indigenous SDF or science and technology writing, but I'm very cautious about the gesture to appropriate Indigenous cosmologies as a solution to Western problems. because in the Canadian Indigenous state that the relations between a sovereign indigenous entity and a political nation state is still quite fragile. So sort of my personal sort of political orientation to that is to figure out how to support, but not to appropriate. So if it is an indigenous led something, then I figure out how to support it rather than appropriating it as a solution to my problem as somebody who's sort of social.
Because the rights of nature, I would say, it's just so the rights of nature. Endemic to the cosmology. It's theirs, it belongs to them. And I really wonder if on one hand it is not appropriation or it is not misappropriation, or we would like to listen to them. What is it that they have? And whether we like it or not, we have already appropriated much of the indigenous knowledge. I speak of myself when we talk about creation-centered spirituality. It's always been theirs. It is my mother's animism, which was dismissed as pagan and primitive, but now it is elevated in the academy. And to me, how do we acknowledge that? And how I am in the same dilemma where we say we don't appropriate or misappropriate, but what is it in social work practice that we acknowledge? And also to say it belongs to them. And it is they who speak to us and not us speaking about this, it's theirs.
Sorry, this is a bit weird. Is the sound better now online? Does that work? No, does it not? And so the problem is, I think what we need to do is come closer to the laptop, because this is where the sound is being picked up. And I don't think there's any technology in this room that can make this better. We'll try. Any other comments or yes? Would you like to come? Please come to the laptop.
Hello, everybody. It's good to see you. Thank you for some really challenging and interesting presentations. I'm Sarah Banks from Durham University, UK, and I'm particularly interested in the ethical challenges that a post-humanist approach presents us in social work, which you have addressed. And I think, Heather, your presentation, I was intrigued by the kind of philosophical conversations you had with Hamza, who is a migrant background social worker.
Yeah.
And if the natural contract is a paradigm, an intuition, as you describe it, then in a sense it's almost like this suburb of Gothenburg and this social worker are kind of, are they in their own little world? How do they relate to that, you know, outside world, which is still locked in the outdated social contract? And are the people in the suburb mindful of this kind of new way of being? It seems to work. You've given us a kind of the positive view, but I'm particularly interested in how you did the philosophical conversations and how Hamza himself articulated his worldview.
I think what I'll maybe come to your, and this is homage to the laptop. In terms of the ethics, I think most of the sort of post-human philosophies, and most people are comfortable with the post-human anyway, but most philosophies that are trying to think about relations and not focusing on humans. Human ethics don't apply, and I think that's the bottom line, is that you have Spinoza and Deleuze talking about ethology, and there is the way that we think of human ethics, it doesn't apply, because you immediately get into all sorts of problems about, you know, do we kill the weed or do we just kill the person because they're the problem if everything is equivalent? So I think that's a problem to be solved. In terms of Barry Hoon, I guess I am, I've been interested in the work that I do around how do you restate these ways of imposing solutions in places, and how do you actually understand from the ground what are the ways of living that people create for themselves? Because, you know, areas that I've worked in in Scotland, where I'm from, that have been problematic, work incredibly well for people in all sorts of interesting ways on the ground. So for me, it's about how do you reframe what's going on there. For Hamza, he was it was really clear that, and others, not just Hamza, I chose Hamza because I had too many voices for one short presentation, but for Hamza, he was really clear, this is the only place that I can be and feel okay, because it works in a way, and it's not a given. It's not to say, oh, let's just do it this way, and sort of, you know, what do they say, scale it up and roll it out in policy talk. It can't happen, because it is about how are relations produced, how do people live. So for me, it's more about understanding and coming to places like Ballyhoon from a position of how do you understand that? And as a social work practitioner, I think working with, he works in a residential unit for young people in Ballyhoon, and he has his orientation to how do you connect with the lake, how do you connect with the space, is how he undertakes his practice. So it's fundamental. It's not let's fine tune this code of ethics or let's do this code. It's about how he understands the world is how he does his practice. So that's very difficult to teach, even because there's a lot of unlearning that has to happen before relearning. But for him and for some of the others that I spoke to, the fact that they feel so excluded from, and I feel as though I'm doing ethnic Swedes a real bad turn in this, and it was conscious I was reading it thinking, lumping them all into one basket. I think it's those are the voices of there's people, and they're really not that, they're different, but they're not nearly as different as places like Ballyhoon, and I think that's why in the conversations with people they felt dissociated. But I think that was part of the gift, was not having to be part of that, but it's a bit of a poison chalice as well as a gift. And I guess if you think with Fair in his earthquake, like life is a bit of a poison chalice, like that's you don't get the utopia. But anyway, does that answer your question? Thank you. Yeah. Next to worship at the centre of the line up the
yes, do I really? I will. Hello. Really lovely presentation. So first of all, thank you. And maybe Tina, and I think there are two caveats. I have not read Michel Serres' work, and I'm perhaps coming at this through Karen Barad's work. So there's it's the confession and kind of the orientation. So I'm curious about, in your talk, you were thinking really carefully about the attunements of infrastructure, it invites the types of, and thinking about it as a type of methodology. I'm curious about what you understand to be the ontology of infrastructures, and whether that then has implications for how it is that you're understanding interventions in these type of mytho-ethical practices, right? That we call infrastructures. And then Heather, I was really fixated on this idea of quasi-objects and the types of their potentials, right? If we were to really attune to their emergences, their breaking apart, their congealing into kind of, I think you mentioned individual collectives, and whether it's that type of attunement to quasi-objects that might then give us understandings of the interventions that are happening and interventions that might possibly come. Does that question make sense?
It sort of does, but I'll
Okay, and this is all, again, it's probably, I have no idea what a quasi object is and or what an infrastructure is. So they're coming from places of ignorance. Thanks.
You want to go first? I love to talk about quasi objects.
so I guess there has a philosophy of relations where all are subjects and objects, and that you almost have, it depends on how where you're positioned as to whether you are subject or object. So he talks about, when the quasi-object stops, you become subject. So this idea of objects that are passed around or exchanged that create relations. So the barbecue would be a great example of that. So he's not in, there's a field of thought within the widest gambit of more than human thought around object-oriented ontology, where they're very object-focused. And then you have the sort of extreme relational end with Deleuze. Serre sits in the middle because he thinks about sort of almost objects that come to presence through relations and do work and then dissolve back. So I guess it's not so, in thinking with him, it's not so much about, and this is where it becomes difficult to think ethically or think about interventions. It's not so much an intervention as an observation. Oh, look how that's working. What's the object in the room? What's how is the computer, is this computer playing the role of the quasi-object in this room, that when it stops, we have a turn to speak. So he's seeing how objects form and dissolve, and they could come from anywhere. So if you had to come and say, I'm going to sort of create, I want to produce my own quasi-object as a form of intervention, it would be very anti-Sergian.
I was thinking more about through the attunement to the emergence of quasi objects.
Yeah. So looking at what's happening.
Ethics and what types of learnings can we gather, I suppose, collectively from that type of attunement?
Yeah, I think that would definitely be a really interesting project. And at present, the work that I did in the summer was exploratory work, if you like, to try to think about what sort of work might be possible that would be more focused. And that would certainly make a really interesting project, is to think about a neighbourhood like Ballyhoon and to look for these objects and think about how they operate. I think that would be interesting, because these few have come up through conversations, but it certainly would be an interesting way to sort of displace the human and think with what's happening. Yeah, for sure.
You're talking barbecue, but also the lake as
well.
Yeah.
The lake's amazing. Yeah, you need to go to that lake, Chris. It's incredible. Oh, wait.
Guys, still hanging in there.
So Rory's question was around sort of the ontologies of infrastructure. So I'm actually just, as one does, use a conference. I'm standing in front of the page. Use a conference to force a deadline to make you do a piece of work. So there are some conflations between ontology and infrastructure in the talk that I just did. But the way that I'm thinking about ontology, particularly political ontology, comes from John Locke. So science studies, and then Anne Raymond also picked it up. And the reason that I gravitate towards political ontology. It's looking at, again, this is coming through science studies, and it looks at some of the studies that folks do that orient around this concept of political ontology, is a focus on the ways in which different kinds of practice enact different kinds of objects, but also enact different aspects of reality through practices. So this is very much a science studies kind of work. And I particularly actually in the settler Indigenous context in the Canadian nation state, I think sort of political ontology is useful for mapping out how different practices create different worlds. Without trying to conflate them as the same. So there is, I think, a tendency in some forms of social work, and certainly the ones that I'm familiar with in Canada, to try to collapse difference actually, and to reconcile different cosmologies that can't actually be reconciled. So there's a way that the concepts around political ontology that emphasize the way that different practices enact different aspects of reality, allow things to maintain their difference without collapsing them. So that's one around political ontology, and then two with infrastructures, the sort of the infrastructural lens or the infrastructural rubric or framework allows engagement with multiple ontologies without trying to collapse them or reconcile them. That's it.
I think, yes, lovely. Could I ask a question? Is I'm curious about in the kind of how the structure itself is imagined, its ontological kind of properties, all of that, because you can think about these two different ontological ethical practices and understanding nature, engaging human nature relation, but the kind of the lens itself is presumably imposing some type of understanding of the beingness of those practices. Yeah. Am I no, that's really confusing.
I didn't follow
No,
that.
so when you were talking about structure, it seemed like there was a type of slightly mutable fixity to them. And am I understanding that correctly?
Yeah.
Okay.
I think if you're not familiar with Lee Starr's work on infrastructures, another way of thinking about infrastructure is network. So she has really good reasons for not using network as the sort of a metaphor or the analogy for how things tie together, even though they're quite different and they work and operate at different scales.
Right.
But she uses infrastructure for particular reasons.
So there is a type of fixity at the moment of observance of the infrastructure.
Oh, that kind of broad. Okay.
Sorry.
Okay. No, you're bringing together things that are not in conversation.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you. Also,
Yeah.
But yeah,
so we have like 10 more minutes, so maybe if somebody else has a question, and then
Quick question, I will.
Thank you. Thank you.
I just want to ask you, how can you, because it was your, on your PowerPoint, that suggestion that there, in the social work fields programs, we don't see much of environmental, natural approaches. How we can imagine that, or how can we think about incorporating it in the future? Because if it's near future or long distance, or are we thinking about global north, global south, because there are differences in needs, and I think can you say something about how we can imagine ourselves, how this would be in the future? Thank you.
What's your name?
I'm sorry, Marcin Borysko, University of Gdańsk.
Wonderful. You should meet Julie, who's sitting right behind you, who teaches a course on environmental social work in Canada. Let's make that connection. So I would encourage you to hang out afterwards. Julie will be here all week, and we're doing another talk on Friday. So you should hang out with Julie because she does some really fantastic work in Canada. So that's one answer. That's the easy answer. Talk to Julie. But the more complicated answer, I think, is at least in the Canadian state. So we have sort of this new education framework that requires that we do something about the environment within social work in Canada now. But we're all sort of at the beginning stages of this. So Julie is actually, a lot of the curriculum work that Julie does is like absolutely at the forefront of that in the Canadian nation state. Currently, the way that I see the uptake of questions is within versions of environmental justice. So that's where it's showing the easiest. That's been the easiest way in for social work education, which is to roll nature into existing rubrics for thinking about human well-being. So it tends to be around community work. It tends to be around environmental justice, which treats nature as a resource that should be equally distributed among people. So it sort of rolls nature within the social contract.
So it's not fair. It's not that kind of version. It's still quite interest-centric. And the other person you talked about was Dorothy, who's online. She does some really cool work. There's a cool paper on that she did with a colleague that around how to tune into the world. Yeah, so that's some of the ways that it's showing in Canada. There's lots of tensions in Canada around because I guess the sort of the cultural moment is really intense, and there's so many pressures to understand what's going on in the world that there's no room in the curriculum to add in additional courses or add in. So there's some of the very early conversations that are happening are around, do you have a separate course on environment, or do you infuse environmental content through the entire curriculum, and how to manage that? And currently that's at a school by school basis. So it's not a collectively held conversation. Though again, talk to Julie, because Julie has these sort of amazing networks that bring together folks across Canada from the different universities and stuff like that. So Julie would probably, I don't know if Julie, do you feel like, are you like, I am on 2 hours of sleep, don't call me out. But yeah, so.
And to get the online people, they are able to speak freely.
Sorry, we're running out of energy. The battery is
Yeah,
very low.
I know. We also running out of time, so we have 5 minutes left. And that's almost it. Do you online people have any questions?
We miss you. We wish you were here.
Yeah, Dorothy.
Maybe I don't know if it's a question, but sort of just a reflection or some thoughts. As I was listening through the various presentations, I couldn't help but sort of find the idea of contract jarring. And Heather in particular, thank you very much for sort of giving further explanation of how contract might be thought. In my own experience, your contract is such a strongly imbued with particular meanings. I'm thinking, I do think transaction when I hear contract. I do think enforceability. I do think anthropocentrism. So my thinking about it is this: on the one hand, I do struggle with the new materialists who create seemingly a new word for every single thing that they write about, and that can be difficult as well. But when I was hearing about the contract, I was thinking, are we stretching terms to the point of them becoming unrecognizable, and then how helpful is that? I don't know if that question is making sense.
And maybe I can just on my behalf. My name is Satu Rantaturk, I'm from Finland. Thank you about the session, and thank you for introducing this book to me. I have had at times a little bit troubles of hearing, and maybe one of the things that in a way emerged, and it doesn't have to do with this language, is how he deals with violence in this book. And I think it's kind of a central theme, and much of our focus is on violence, especially these days, in a way or another, and it kind of, how to say, therefore the nature still remains at the background. I think there would be really much more to sort of get into in relation to the natural contract book, but that will maybe take place in the future. But I think the presentations were really super dense, and the social contract, social question, environmental question, natural contracts. It could be like a couple of days seminar. So thank you.
If I could chime in as well. Hello, everyone. My name is Jamie. I'm calling in from the Northeast US. And so the sun is about to rise here. And I really appreciate the different presentations, and I'm thinking about epistemologies and language, and how we think about relating to and knowing nature and each other. And think the first question around like indigenous ways of living, right? And thinking of the global South, epistemologies of the global South, and the need for other ways of relating to the world and what helps to do that. So thinking about plants and the vibrancy of colors and sound and our senses. And I just think that that's a really important part of acknowledging ontology, and the role of ontology is acknowledging the role of how we know what we know and what are the ways that we can shift relations, right? Shift knowing the world. So I don't know where I have notes and notes and notes from all of the information that was presented today. So a lot to think about. But when we, in thinking about symbiosis and reciprocity and relationship means knowing, and relating to, different systems differently than our Western ways of knowing. So, and I think in that there is a need to acknowledge that, for instance, with plant life, that there are wisdoms that have existed for a very long time about knowing plants and relationship with plants that are not acknowledged by, our one world, but that are acknowledged in other ways. So I think it's important to pay honor to that. And also think about the ways that that Western kind of dominant paradigms can change through epistemology. And what does that look like? Does that look like learning how to engage the world through our senses in different ways?
Fantastic. Sorry for the back and forth with the laptop. That is the only way of getting some sound into this. Thank you so much, everybody, for your comments and questions. And I think we are officially out of time now. But do you want to say some closing remarks?
My closing remark would just be on this in the names of like the night struggling with this. I think that as a British person, there's a strong history in Scotland of
No, I can't move it.
there's a strong history in Scotland of property, relationship with land and soil. And I think I've also done a lot of work around Italian thought. And when you look at Italian thinkers like Vico and Machiavelli, there's a really strong connection with the more than human there. So I almost feels that when we have this notion of the West does this, it actually doesn't do this. That's the dominant thing, but it does lots of things, and it's not. I think it's really important to explore those different scenes of thoughts because they all exist. They're just silenced, or they're just in that was my thinking around this. Okay. That's and maybe the other thing I would say, sorry, just on the environmental question, the thing that I think is interesting with SER's natural contract is not so much about the thing outside we call nature. It's about so much more than that. And there is a real problem for me with a lot of social work and environment scholarship, which sees it as an add-on. How do we include it? How do we get it in? When you think with SER, everything is radically reconfigured. You're rethinking your relations with everything. So it's not just about, I'm going to think about us not destroying whatever the sea, but it's actually, it changes how you relate to other people as well. And that's for me is what's really powerful about it. How you do it, I don't know. how you encourage other people, or if it should be a mission, or if it should just be in the mix. I don't know. Anyway, that's me.
I feel like you're turning it over to me. I would for coming and hanging out. There's handouts somewhere that have our contact information. If you want to be in the future, we are nerdy and friendly. So we span lots of time zones. So sometimes the things that we do are painful and you have to get up at 2 a.m. If you want to hang out. But otherwise, we'll be around. I think at least Verena and I will be around for the rest of the conference. I think Heather has to head out. She's not feeling super great. But we're always happy to hang out and So thank you very much for coming. And I guess we look forward to continuing chatting over the next couple of days.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having us. This has been fantastic. Thank you so much.
There goes the cables. Sorry about that. But thank you for being here. And
All right.
bye-bye.
Verena, this was recorded. Is that something that's going to be shared among the More Than Human SIG?
So this is we have a YouTube channel, and we would essentially upload that to the YouTube channel, but maybe Tina can send another email with the link to the recording again. So yeah.
Okay, I'll look up the
That
YouTube.
will be great.
Thank you.
Thanks so much for having us. This was really, really worth it. Thank you so much and enjoy the rest of the conference.
Bye-bye.
Okay, bye.
Last word from me. Are you sure you want to stop recording?